to the sixth episode of our China under Trump series. Today we will be discussing trade, and to join me there is Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure.
So essentially, Martin, throughout his campaign, President Trump was very adamantly attacking China and blaming it for a very unfair trade relationship with the US. He wanted to slap a 45% tariff on China, and when he came into office, he appointed a very anti-China figure in Peter Navarro as the head of the new National Trade Council. However, none of this protectionist rhetoric has yet translated into actual action. And I know you've just come back from the China Development Forum in Beijing, and I was wondering, in terms of the Chinese participants' views on this kinds of discussion, do they truly think that a trade war with the US is a real possibility right now?
I think they are as puzzled about the Trump administration as we are, as uncertain about the Trump administration as we are, and indeed as Americans are. So, as you rightly say, they have incredibly protectionist rhetoric. Mr. Navarro even wrote a book called Death by China, if I remember correctly. But the Chinese that I've spoken to, it's obviously a limited subset of very knowledgeable Chinese who are very familiar with the United States. They really don't know what's going to happen. They hope that by skillful diplomacy and by explaining to Mr. Trump the realities, there's supposedly a meeting between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and Mr. Trump next month, that he will be dissuaded from going ahead. But they think it is a possibility, and they have thought through, to some extent, what they would do if it were to happen. And I think at this moment, we just have to see. There's no doubt that within the United States, and I've written previous columns about this, there are enormous interests, against a trade war with China. American companies have invested massively in China. China is an integrated part of their production systems. One of the participants in the China Development Forum was Mr. Tim Cook of Apple. He didn't get there by accident. I mean, Apple is the most valuable company in the world. So that's just one indication of the massive US vested interest. And then there's a strategic relationship which involves many other issues, North Korea and so forth. So I think that Mr. Trump will have to be a very, very brave and determined man if he goes ahead with it, but there is a possibility.
And we always talk about this potential trade war, but on very practical terms, what would this entail? I mean, would there be tariffs, WTO litigations? What do you think it would look like?
Well, this is what I think at the moment. If they were to go ahead with this tariff proposal, a 45% tariff in general, that would be clearly, I think, WTO illegal. American experts on trade policy say it might well be legal under US law, but not under the WTO, and the Chinese would clearly take it to the WTO. The Americans can do things which are clearly WTO legal, safeguard actions and, as they're called, emergency protection and anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties, but then they would have to make a domestic case that specific Chinese products or specific products are damaging US industry. So that's a very different thing. It's not what they've been talking about, but they could do that legally. But let's suppose they went for this 45% tariff or that sort of idea. The Chinese that I've spoken to point out that there are at least two areas where the Chinese government can directly act. The first is the purchases of aircraft. China is the biggest aviation market in the world, and they can simply say, we'll never buy another Boeing. And it would be great for Airbus. Just fantastic for Airbus. And that would hurt Boeing. Good, this is the biggest aviation market in the world. The other area is food, soybeans, and that's another really big interest. Remember how overrepresented in the US Congress, above all the Senate, the farm states are. So they think they could target those two areas and it would hurt. What the next round would be after that, I think nobody I talked to actually really had an idea. But that's how it might go. I suspect now that for these reasons, the Americans might go the legal protection route, countervailing duties, anti-dumping. There's a lot of pressure on steel, for example. There's a lot of complaints about Chinese excess capacity and dumping. So they could go that way and it would be relatively harmless.
And in terms of the possibility of this trade war, many people argue, including yourself in your columns, that at the end of the day, these two countries in reality do need each other in a number of ways. You just talked about how the US still has a strategic interest in China, etc. Also, China could play, I argue, a very important role in helping actually President Trump go ahead and finance this big infrastructure push he's been talking about. And even without this infrastructure push, the US faces a huge financing gap when it comes to infrastructure, something like $1.5 trillion through 2025. I mean, would you say that this is correct, that China could play a role in this?
Well, the broad point I would make is I think the US can finance itself. It has the capacity to borrow. It can still borrow on very favorable terms. It does still produce the principal international reserve currency. But the United States, of course, is a country with a large current account deficit. And that basically reflects the fact that it invests more than it saves. So they need people who will supply the funds if the interest rates are to remain low in the United States. And China is the biggest, or one of the biggest surplus savers in the world with Germany. Now, those are the countries they're at war with, on trade war, as it were, because, of course, these surpluses, the other side of the trade surpluses are, if you like, the mirror image of their capital debt, capital deficit. That is to say, they save too little. So yes, it would be very awkward for them if the Chinese really were to say, well, we're not going to invest at all anymore in the United States. I think actually the US could cope with this, but this is certainly a concern, and it's not entirely illegitimate.
And if we had to flip it around in terms of how the US is still absolutely needed for China, the US remains the biggest buyer of Chinese exports, and many people argue it is very difficult to replace a market like the US right now, even though there is a lot of growth.
Actually. I mean, China has a giant bilateral surplus with the US. Its dependence on trade has declined, but still trade is very important. It has essential imports. The US is an immensely important market for final production from China, and there is no replacement. The only replacement is Europe. It's the only other huge consumer market, and I'm absolutely sure if the US really closed China off, and that's one of the worries, that Europe will be under a lot of pressure to follow suit. That's why the trade war could go global. It's very difficult for the US just to do it on its own. I think certainly the Europeans would feel very frightened. But there's another side to this. The Chinese are very determined to develop their own technology, but also to import technology. They continue to be very keen on that. And US companies remain among the world's leaders in most industries. They are immensely sophisticated, and they own vast amounts of intellectual property, and the Chinese want access to this. So again, they want the foreign investment. When I was there, we had a meeting with the Premier, Li Keqiang, and he made very clear that he continued to be very keen to see foreign investment, and the US is among the most important sources of such investment. And then beyond this, of course, we haven't discussed this, is an international relations aspect. North Korea. If they're going to deal with North Korea, they need Chinese help. These two great powers, they're the world's two greatest powers, really do require a fruitful and harmonious relationship if there's to be world stability, quite apart from prosperity.
And I guess that has to also be squared with the whole approach that seems to be quite transactional that the Trump administration thinks of having when it comes to relationships also in Asia.
They don't seem to have any abiding principles. It's purely transactional. I find this very scary. I don't think it's the right way to behave and to think about the world. But on a transactional basis, they need China and China needs the US. So I hope, we must hope that better counsels will prevail and that they will manage to get through this without the relationship blowing up.
So in conclusion, would it be fair to say that as of now, and we're filming this on the 24th of March, maybe an uncomfortable cooperation might be likelier than an outright trade war between these two countries?
The moment we have reason to suspect that Mr. Trump's bark is worse than his bite. He says a lot of things for his audience which he doesn't really mean, and he has tremendous obstacles to putting in place what he has been thinking about, both within his administration, which is very split, with Congress, with the American business establishment, and further on. But I find him impossible to read and impossible to predict. So one has to hope for the best, but I'm not sure about it.
Well, Martin, thank you very much for your insights.
Great pleasure.